Hello, everyone. Welcome to 2025, the Oyster Aero PearlCast podcast. I am kicking off this year, extremely lucky to kick off with an entrepreneur many years ago, Jason Dickstein. Welcome, Jason.
Welcome, or thank you, Jeff, and thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on your podcast.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, you would know Jason and Michelle being involved in ASA and Jason being involved in everything export related, compliance related. Um, so I kind of want to kick off. We normally talk about founders. So were you in aviation and got into law? Were you in law and decided that aviation would be an area? Did that happen because of, ASA? Like, can you just walk us through a little bit of the founding of your firm and the purpose and how all that kind of came together?
Sure thing. I actually started off as a labor lawyer.
Okay.
I was working in a labor law firm, and I had an opportunity to start doing some aviation work. Um, Many people know Sarah McLeod. I worked with her and her partner, Tony Obadal. And over the years, I met a lot of friends in aviation. I ended up leaving that firm to go over to ASA as their in-house counsel. And after I went over to ASA, I had several companies approach me and say, "Hey, we didn't know you were thinking of leaving. We would have loved to have followed you to another firm."
Sure.
So after working for ASA for about 2 years, I ended up leaving and starting my own firm. Um, and I mean, a lot of people know the story that I was working for Michelle. We had been friends, but during the course of us working together, we got to know each other better. We ultimately ended up getting married. And a lot of people just assume that my first client, the reason that I went out and hung out my shingle, was the Aviation Suppliers Association, Michelle's trade association.
Sure.
In fact, though, my very first client was the Aircraft Electronics Association. Paula Dirks was the president at the time. Terry Pearsall was a good friend of mine, and he was their head of government affairs. And Paula and Terry were the ones who originally approached me and said, "You should just go out on your own. You can represent ASA, but you can represent us." And they were the ones really gave me the confidence. And, people talk about the courage of being an entrepreneur.
Sure.
It makes it very easy to be an entrepreneur when you have someone approach you and say, "We want to be your first customer."
Sure.
So, to this day, I still have a great deal of appreciation for Terry and for Paula and for AEA because they gave me that opportunity to start my own business.
That's fantastic. And so how long have you been running your law firm for now?
So I started the firm in 1999. So
Okay.
it's a little over 25 years. Um,
Wow. That's
and,
fantastic.
we're basically a boutique law firm for the aviation community.
Yep.
And it's mostly the aftermarket. We represent aircraft parts manufacturers, MROs, aircraft parts distributors. We do some work for airlines. Um, and I sometimes describe us as being like a general practice firm, except for aircraft parts. So in a
Got
general
it.
practice firm, you might see a lawyer that does wills, divorces,
Hmm.
adoptions. We do compliance with aviation regulations in the United States, in the European Union, in Canada. We've done some work with compliance in Japan and China and the UK. But we also do the other things that are related to aircraft parts. So we help
Sure.
people with import classification, with export compliance, hazardous materials compliance. We started doing hazmat training about 25 years ago. And since then, we've done at least 2 trainings a year for the aviation community just to try and keep them on the right track. Big focus of our firm has always been supporting companies in their compliance efforts.
Got it. So you keep people out of trouble. That's the mission statement for sure.
Yeah.
How has compliance maybe changed over that 25 years? Has there been, I mean, of course, it's always changing. It's a dynamic environment, right? But I mean, what have you noticed if you could sum up maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years? Like, what do you think has fundamentally shifted?
Um, so a lot of the fundamental shifts are actually entirely predictable because
Okay.
what happens is if there is some sort of problem, we suddenly decide that that's where our enforcement focus needs to be.
Right.
And as a consequence, that's where the compliance focus is. So,
Got it.
for example, in May of 1996, we had the value jet crash, which
Mm-hmm.
was caused by chemical oxygen generators, which were hazardous materials that was improperly packaged. And since then, we as an industry have been focused on hazmat compliance.
Right. Got it.
Our focus on export compliance really came after 9/11. And it became part of a package of ways to preserve American security, and ways to better use US export laws as sort of policy tools for the United States. Um, and I've seen ratcheting up of export compliance and export enforcement over the years. Obviously, the 2014 incursion by Russia into eastern Ukraine um, caused a little bit of a ratchet up, but then the active incursion into Ukraine by active duty Russian forces caused a dramatic change in export law. Um, and the easy side of that is everybody knows you can't export aircraft parts from the United States to Russia or Belarus under those standards.
Correct.
But
Okay.
the problems that we run into are the intermediaries. So it's legal for the United States to export to the UAE, and it's legal in the UAE under their laws to export to Russia. But it's not legal under US laws to have your articles re exported to Russia. So that's actually been a big area of concern and a big area of compliance for us and our clients is trying to identify ways to protect transactions to make sure that the things that we're exporting can't be re-exported to a place like Russia or Belarus, or if it requires a license, making sure that the re-export gets the appropriate licenses, having the right controls in place as a US company to make sure that you're not getting into trouble. And this
Sure.
is a big concern. You know, you talk about the changes in the industry, there has been a big ramp up in enforcement. In recent years, we've seen a ramp up against Iranian sanctions violators, where there was sort of a stream of companies that were selling US sourced aircraft parts into Iran, who ended up getting prosecuted and going to jail. So imagine that, you know, you're an aircraft parts manufacturer or distributor or an MRO, and your peers are going to jail because of transactions.
Wow.
So what we're now seeing is a second wave of prosecutions against folks that are violating the Russian sanctions. So the first wave was Iran, the second wave is Russia, and we're seeing a lot of indictments and we're seeing people who are getting actual jail time again for facilitating transactions of aircraft parts that end up in Russia. So for US based companies, it's particularly important to have a robust compliance system to protect your company from getting involved in those transactions.
Sure. Sure. Um, well, I guess, how does the framework typically go from like administration to administration? So, does it kind of change? Did we have a different framework in 2020 than we do now versus coming up? I mean, what kind of how does that work,
So
basically?
historically, you don't tend to see an administration-based change.
Hmm.
Historically, the policies that we're trying to protect through the export laws are the same policies from administration to administration. So that
Sure.
usually doesn't change things until now.
Okay.
I feel like it's one of these, but wait, if you order right now, you can get this free Ginsu knife. Um, In 2 weeks, Donald Trump will be inaugurated as president of the United States, and he has already made public statements that he is generally opposed to sanctions programs. He's actually stated that he would like to replace sanctions programs with tariff programs. And I'm not sure how he is going to do that because honestly, sanctions, export sanctions, and import tariffs typically apply in different ways. They're different sorts of laws, and they typically are enforcing different sorts of policies. So I'm not sure how this is going to work and what this is going to look like. It is possible that our sanctions programs won't change. It's also possible that after the president is inaugurated, the next administration may have radically different ideas.
Hmm, interesting.
So it's one of these
So,
things where I am telling people watch the Aviation Suppliers Association blog, watch the MARPA blog, because we'll be publishing articles to keep people apprised of how the regulations are changing and what that means. They could get stronger, in which case companies need to protect themselves and remain compliant. They could also get weaker, in which case there may be some new market opportunities for companies that maybe couldn't get a license to sell into a market and maybe can get a license to sell into that same market in the future.
well, really interesting. Thank you for that. So, we kind of, again, we focus on the startups mostly, and I have seen a few Oyster clients come on that are good. They're new, they're hanging their own shingle. The entrepreneurial spirit's great. Where do you start with compliance and starting your own company? I mean, everybody can go out and hire you. I mean, that we let's set that aside. But, where do what kind of resources can help people, start to make sure, because the best compliance system is when you're starting from scratch, right? I mean, you kind of get all that in early. You're not going back and fixing things. So, what do you recommend? What kind of playbook do you recommend?
So honestly, compliance for a small business is overwhelming. It's daunting because there's a
Sure.
lot of laws out there. There's a lot
Yeah.
of regulations out there, and it's a lot to keep track of. I think one of the best things for a small business is to join the relevant trade associations. So if
Right.
you're an MRO, join ARSA. If you're a distributor, join ASA. If you're a manufacturer, join MARPA. Because each of those trade associations is putting out information about compliance. They're trying to make people aware of how the compliance modes are changing, what opportunities there are, what threats there are, and trying to give people easy guidance on what they need to do to stay on the right side of the law. Um, I mean, I'm a compliance lawyer, and I
Sure.
find that with all the different laws out there, environmental laws and tax laws and accounting standards and securities laws and hazmat laws and export laws and import laws and aviation laws, um, it's so difficult to keep on top of all of them
Sure.
that you need an outside resource to feed you. Being a member of one of those trade associations gives you access not just to the information that is being published by the associations, but most of them have training. So, for example, ASA does webinars for members. Those webinars are free. You can have as many of your employees on those webinars as you want, and they record the webinars so that if you're a member and you look through their library and say, oh, it looks like they did something really useful before I was a member 3 years ago, it's in the library. Now that you're a member, you can watch it for free.
Wow. Okay. All right. That's definitely some good advice. And of course, ourselves starting up a new platform, we're always looking to kind of help the compliance journey along. So you've even given me some ideas on things that we can incorporate, like end item use, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
into our platform. So thank you very much. I
Yeah.
guess
The other
last
thing
que-
I'd advise, though,
Yeah.
is for someone who's in a new business, understand the difference between the regulations and the common norms of the industry. So there's going to be common norms surrounding, say, for example, traceability on
Hmm.
aircraft parts. And it's important to recognize that those norms change and sometimes change rapidly. And what you need to do in order to seal the deal, as far as something like traceability, isn't always regulated. And because it's not regulated, it means that you have some business flexibility in those areas. But on the other hand, the things that are truly regulated, there's no flexibility there. You need to make sure you're in compliance with the regulations.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they find you?
We have a website, thewashingtonaviation.com,
Okay.
because we're the Washington Aviation Group. You can also email me directly at Jason, Jason, at washingtonaviation.com. Also, if you're a member of one of the trade associations, typically there are ways to contact me through the trade association websites as well. And we do try and support a wide variety of trade associations because we believe very strongly in compliance.
Fantastic. Well, Jason, thank you. And I guess buckle up for 2025, right?
Hey, we're all in it together.
All right. Well, thanks for being on the Oyster podcast, and we look forward to working with you more.
Thanks a lot for having me, Jeff.
All right. Take care.